Chapter 11, Part 1 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose by Grant Allen. Chapter 11, Part 1. The episode of the officer who understood perfectly. After our fortunate escape from the clutches of our two admiring Tibetan hosts, we wound our way slowly back through the Maharaja's territory towards Sir Ivor's headquarters. On the third day out from the Lamasery, we camped in a romantic Himalayan valley, a narrow green glen with a brawling stream running in white cataracts and rapids down its midst. We were able to breathe freely now. We could enjoy the great tapering deodars that rose in ranks on the hillsides, the snow-clad needles of ramping rock that bounded the view to north and south, the feathery bamboo jungle that fringed and half obscured the mountain torrent, whose cool music, alas, fallaciously cool, was borne to us through the dense green of waving foliage. Lady Meadowcroft was so delighted at having got clear away from those murderous and saintly Tibetans that for a while she almost forgot to grumble. She even condescended to admire the deep cleft ravine in which we bivouacked for the night, and to admit that the orchids which hung from the tall trees were as fine as any at her florist's in Piccadilly. Though how they can have got them out here already in this outlandish place, the most fashionable kinds, when we in England have to grow them with such care in expensive hothouses, she said, really passes my comprehension. She seemed to think that orchids originated in Covent Garden. Early next morning I was engaged with one of my native men in lighting the fire to boil our kettle, for in spite of all misfortunes, we still made tea with creditable punctuality, when a tall and good-looking Nepalese approached us from the hills with cat-like tread, and stood before me in an attitude of profound supplication. He was a well-dressed young man, like a superior native servant. His face was broad and flat, but kindly and good-humored. He salaamed many times, but still said nothing. "Ask him what he wants," I cried, turning to our fair-weather friend the cook. The deferential Nepalese did not wait to be asked. "Salaam, Sahib," he said, bowing again very low till his forehead almost touched the ground. "You are European Doctor Sahib?" "I am," I answered, taken aback at being thus recognized in the forest of Nepaul. "But how in wonder did you come to know it?" "You camped near here when you passed this way before, and you doctor little native girl who got sore eyes. All the country here tell you is very great physician. So I come and to see if you will turn aside to my village to help us." "Where did you learn English?" I exclaimed, more and more astonished. "I is servant one time at British residence at the Maharaja's city. Pick up English there. Also pick up plenty loopy. Very good business at British residence. Now gone back home to my own village, retired gentleman." And he drew himself up with conscious dignity. I surveyed the retired gentleman from head to foot. He had an air of distinction which not even his bare toes could altogether mar. He was evidently a person of local importance. "And what did you want me to visit your village for?" I inquired dubiously. "Why, traveller Sahib ill there, sir. Velly ill. Got plague. Great first class Sahib. All same like governor. Ill. Fit to die. Send me out all times to find European doctor." "Plague?" I repeated, startled. He nodded. "Yes, plague. All same like them hab him so bad down Bombay way." "Do you know his name?" I asked, for though one does not like to desert a fellow creature in distress, I did not care to turn aside from my road on such an errand, with Hilda and Lady Meadowcroft, unless for some amply sufficient reason. The retired gentleman shook his head in the most emphatic fashion. "How me know?" he answered, opening the palms of his hands, as if to show he had nothing concealed in them. "Forget European name all time so easily, and traveller Sahib name very hard to remember. Not got English name, him European foreigner." "A European foreigner?" I repeated. "And you say he is seriously ill? Plague is no trifle. Well, wait a minute. I'll see what the ladies say about it. How far off is your village?" He pointed with his hand somewhat vaguely to the hillside. "2 hours' walk," he answered, with the mountaineer's habit of reckoning distance by time, which extends, under the like circumstances, the whole world over. I went back to the tents and consulted Hilda and Lady Meadowcroft. Our spoiled child pouted and was utterly averse to any detour of any sort. "Let's get back straight to Ivor," she said petulantly. "I've had enough of camping out. It's all very well in its way for a week, but when they begin to talk about cutting your throat and all that, it ceases to be a joke and becomes a wee bit uncomfortable. I want my feather bed. I object to their villages." "But consider, dear," Hilda said gently, "this traveler is ill, all alone in a strange land. How can Hubert desert him? It is a doctor's duty to do what he can to alleviate pain and to cure the sick. What would we have thought ourselves, when we were at the Lamasery, if a body of European travelers had known we were there, imprisoned and in danger of our lives, and had passed by on the other side, without attempting to rescue us?" Lady Meadowcroft knit her forehead. "That was us," she said, with an impatient nod after a pause, "and this is another person. You can't turn aside for everybody who's ill in all Nepaul. And plague, too, so horrid. Besides, how do we know this isn't another plan of these hateful people to lead us into danger?" "Lady Meadowcroft is quite right," I said hastily. "I never thought about that. There may be no plague, no patient at all. I will go up with this man alone, Hilda, and find out the truth. It will only take me 5 hours at most. By noon I shall be back with you." "What, and leave us here unprotected among the wild beasts and the savages?" Lady Meadowcroft cried, horrified. "In the midst of the forest, Dr. Cumberledge, how can you?" "You are not unprotected," I answered, soothing her. "You have Hilda with you. She is worth 10 men. And besides, our Nepalese are fairly trustworthy." Hilda bore me out in my resolve. She was too much of a nurse, and had imbibed too much of the true medical sentiment, to let me desert a man in peril of his life in a tropical jungle. So, in spite of Lady Meadowcroft, I was soon winding my way up a steep mountain track, overgrown with creeping Indian weeds, on my road to the still problematical village graced by the residence of the retired gentleman. After 2 hours' hard climbing, we reached it at last. The retired gentleman led the way to a house in a street of the little wooden hamlet. The door was low. I had to stoop to enter it. I saw in a moment this was indeed no trick. On a native bed in a corner of the one room, a man lay desperately ill. A European, with white hair and with a skin well bronzed by exposure to the tropics. Ominous dark spots beneath the epidermis showed the nature of the disease. He tossed restlessly as he lay, but did not raise his fevered head, or look at my conductor. "Well, any news of Ramdas?" he asked at last, in a parched and feeble voice. Parched and feeble as it was, I recognized it instantly. The man on the bed was Sebastian, no other. "No news of Lamdas," the retired gentleman replied, with an unexpected display of womanly tenderness. "Lamdas clean gone, not come any more, but I bling you back European doctor Sahib." Sebastian did not look up from his bed even then. I could see he was more anxious about a message from his scout than about his own condition. "The rascal!" he moaned with his eyes closed tight. "The rascal! He has betrayed me." and he tossed uneasily. I looked at him and said nothing. Then I seated myself on a low stool by the bedside, and took his hand in mine to feel his pulse. The wrist was thin and wasted. The face, too, I noticed, had fallen away greatly. It was clear that the malignant fever which accompanies the disease had wreaked its worst on him. So weak and ill was he, indeed, that he let me hold his hand, with my fingers on his pulse, for half a minute or more, without ever opening his eyes or displaying the slightest curiosity at my presence. One might have thought that European doctors abounded in Nepaul, and that I had been attending him for a week, with a mixture, as before, at every visit. "Your pulse is weak and very rapid," I said slowly in a professional tone. "You seem to me to have fallen into a perilous condition." At the sound of my voice he gave a sudden start. Yet even so, for a second he did not open his eyes. The revelation of my presence seemed to come upon him as in a dream. "Like Cumberledge's," he muttered to himself, gasping. "Exactly like Cumberledge's. But Cumberledge is dead. I must be delirious. If I didn't know to the contrary, I could have sworn it was Cumberledge's." I spoke again, bending over him. "How long have the glandular swellings been present, Professor?" I asked with quiet deliberativeness. This time he opened his eyes sharply and looked up in my face. He swallowed a great gulp of surprise. His breath came and went. He raised himself on his elbows and stared at me with a fixed stare. "Cumberledge!" he cried. "Cumberledge! Come back to life, then? They told me you were dead, and here you are, Cumberledge!" "Who told you I was dead?" I asked sternly. He stared at me, still in a dazed way. He was more than half comatose. "Your guide Ramdas," he answered at last, half incoherently. "He came back by himself, came back without you. He swore to me he had seen all your throats cut in Tibet. He alone had escaped. The Buddhists had massacred you." "He told you a lie," I said shortly. "I thought so. I thought so. And I sent him back for confirmatory evidence. But the rouge has never brought it." He let his head drop on his rude pillow heavily. "Never, never brought it." I gazed at him full of horror. The man was too ill to hear me, too ill to reason, too ill to recognize the meaning of his own words, almost. Otherwise, perhaps, he would hardly have expressed himself quite so frankly. Though, to be sure, he had said nothing to criminate himself in any way. His action might have been due to anxiety for our safety. I fixed my glance on him long and dubiously. What ought I to do next? As for Sebastian, he lay with his eyes closed, half oblivious of my presence. The fever had gripped him hard. He shivered and looked helpless as a child. In such circumstances the instincts of my profession rose imperative within me. I could not nurse a case properly in this wretched hut. The one thing to be done was to carry the patient down to our camp in the valley. There at least we had air and pure running water. I asked a few questions from the retired gentleman as to the possibility of obtaining sufficient bearers in the village. As I supposed any number were forthcoming immediately. Your Nepalese is by nature a beast of burden. He can carry anything up and down the mountains, and spends his life in the act of carrying. I pulled out my pencil, tore a leaf from my notebook, and scribbled a hasty note to Hilda. "The invalid is, whom do you think? Sebastian. He is dangerously ill, with some malignant fever. I am bringing him down into camp to nurse. Get everything ready for him." Then I handed it over to a messenger, found for me by the retired gentleman, to carry to Hilda. My host himself I could not spare, as he was my only interpreter. In a couple of hours we had improvised a rough woven grass hammock as an ambulance couch, had engaged our bearers, and had got Sebastian under way for the camp by the river. When I arrived at our tents, I found Hilda had prepared everything for our patient with her usual cleverness. Not only had she got a bed ready for Sebastian, who was now almost insensible, but she had even cooked some arrowroot from our stores beforehand, so that he might have a little food with a dash of brandy in it, to recover him after the fatigue of the journey down the mountain. By the time we had laid him out on a mattress in a cool tent, with the fresh air blowing about him, and had made him eat the meal prepared for him, he really began to look comparatively comfortable. Lady Meadowcroft was now our chief trouble. We did not dare to tell her it was really plague, but she had got near enough back to civilization to have recovered her faculty for profuse grumbling, and the idea of the delay that Sebastian would cause us drove her wild with annoyance. "Only 2 days off from Ivor," she cried, "and that comfortable bungalow! And now to think we must stop here in the woods a week or 10 days for this horrid old professor! Why can't he get worse at once and die like a gentleman? But there, with you to nurse him, Hilda, he'll never get worse. He couldn't die if he tried. He'll linger on and on for weeks and weeks through a beastly convalescence." "Hubert," Hilda said to me when we were alone once more, "we mustn't keep her here. She will be a hindrance, not a help. One way or another we must manage to get rid of her." "How can we?" I asked. "We can't turn her loose upon the mountain roads with a Nepalese escort. She isn't fit for it. She would be frantic with terror." "I've thought of that, and I see only one thing possible. I must go on with her myself as fast as we can push to Sir Ivor's place, and then return to help you nurse the Professor." I saw she was right. It was the sole plan open to us, and I had no fear of letting Hilda go off alone with Lady Meadowcroft and the bearers. She was a host in herself, and could manage a party of native servants at least as well as I could. So Hilda went and came back again. Meanwhile I took charge of the nursing of Sebastian. Fortunately I had brought with me a good stock of jungle medicines in my little traveling case, including plenty of quinine, and under my careful treatment the Professor passed the crisis and began to mend slowly. The first question he asked me when he felt himself able to talk once more was, "Nurse Wade, what has become of her?" For he had not yet seen her. I feared the shock for him. "She is here with me," I answered in a very measured voice. "She is waiting to be allowed to come and help me in taking care of you." He shuddered and turned away. His face buried itself in the pillow. I could see some twinge of remorse had seized upon him. At last he spoke. "Cumberledge," he said in a very low and almost frightened tone, "don't let her come near me. I can't bear it. I can't bear it." Ill as he was, I did not mean to let him think I was ignorant of his motive. "You can't bear a woman whose life you have attempted," I said in my coldest and most deliberate way, "to have a hand in nursing you? You can't bear to let her heap coals of fire on your head. In that you are right. But remember, you have attempted my life too. You have twice done your best to get me murdered." He did not pretend to deny it. He was too weak for subterfuges. He only writhed as he lay. "You are a man," he said shortly, "and she is a woman. That is all the difference." Then he paused for a minute or two. "Don't let her come near me," he moaned once more in a piteous voice. "Don't let her come near me." "I will not," I answered. "She shall not come near you. I spare you that. But you will have to eat the food she prepares, and you know she will not poison you. You will have to be tended by the servants she chooses, and you know they will not murder you. She can heap coals of fire on your head without coming into your tent. Consider that you sought to take her life, and she seeks to save yours. She is as anxious to keep you alive as you are anxious to kill her." He lay as in a reverie. His long white hair made his clear-cut thin face look more unearthly than ever, with the hectic flush of fever upon it. At last he turned to me. "We each work for our own ends," he said in a weary way. "We pursue our own objects. It suits me to get rid of her. It suits her to keep me alive. I'm no good to her dead. Living, she expects to wring a confession out of me, but she shall not have it. Tenacity of purpose is the one thing I admire in life. She has the tenacity of purpose, and so have I. Cumberledge, don't you see it's a mere duel of endurance between us?" "And may the just side win," I answered solemnly. It was several days later before he spoke to me of it again. Hilda had brought some food to the door of the tent and passed it in to me for our patient. "How is he now?" she whispered. Sebastian overheard her voice, and cowering within himself, still managed to answer, "Better, getting better. I shall soon be well now. You have carried your point. You have cured your enemy." "Thank God for that," Hilda said, and glided away silently. Sebastian ate his cup of arrowroot in silence. Then he looked at me with wistful, musing eyes. "Cumberledge," he murmured at last, "after all, I can't help admiring that woman. She's the only person who has ever checkmated me. She checkmates me every time. Steadfastness is what I love. Her steadfastness of purpose and her determination move me." "I wish they would move you to tell the truth," I answered. He mused again. "To tell the truth," he muttered, moving his head up and down. "I have lived for science. Shall I wreck all now? There are truths which it is better to hide than to proclaim. Uncomfortable truths, truths that never should have been, truths which help to make greater truths incredible. But all the same, I cannot help admiring that woman. She has Jock Bannerman's intellect, with a great deal more than Jock Bannerman's force of will. Such firmness, such energy, such resolute patience. She is a wonderful creature. I can't help admiring her." I said no more to him just then. I thought it better to let nascent remorse and nascent admiration work out their own natural effects unimpeded, for I could see our enemy was beginning to feel some sting of remorse. Some men are below it. Sebastian thought himself above it. I felt sure he was mistaken. Yet, even in the midst of these personal preoccupations, I saw that our great teacher was still as ever the pure man of science. He noted every symptom and every change of the disease with professional accuracy. He observed his own case, whenever his mind was clear enough, as impartially as he would have observed any outside patient's. "This is a rare chance, Cumberledge," he whispered to me once in an interval of delirium. "So few Europeans have ever had the complaint, and probably none who were competent to describe the specific subjective and psychological symptoms. The delusions one gets as one sinks into the coma, for example, are of a quite peculiar type. Delusions of wealth and of absolute power, most exhilarating and magnificent. I think myself a millionaire, or a prime minister. Be sure you make a note of that, in case I die. If I recover, of course I can write an exhaustive monograph on the whole history of the disease in the British Medical Journal. But if I die, the task of chronicling these interesting observations will devolve upon you. A most exceptional chance. You are much to be congratulated." "You must not die, Professor," I cried, thinking more, I will confess, of Hilda Wade than of himself. "You must live to report this case for science." I used what I thought the strongest lever I knew for him. He closed his eyes dreamily. "For science, yes, for science. There you strike the right chord. What have I not dared and done for science? But in case I die, Cumberledge, be sure you collect the notes I took as I was sickening. They are most important for the history and etiology of the disease. I made them hourly, and don't forget the main points to be observed as I am dying. You know what they are. This is a rare, rare chance. I congratulate you on being the man who has the first opportunity ever afforded us of questioning an intelligent European case, a case where the patient is fully capable of describing with accuracy his symptoms and his sensations in medical phraseology." He did not die, however. In about another week he was well enough to move. We carried him down to Muzaffarpur, the first large town in the plains thereabouts, and handed him over for the stage of convalescence to the care of the able and efficient station doctor, to whom my thanks are due for much courteous assistance. "And now what do you mean to do?" I asked Hilda, when our patient was placed in other hands and all was over. She answered me without one second's hesitation. "Go straight to Bombay, and wait there till Sebastian takes passage for England." "He will go home, you think, as soon as he is well enough?" "Undoubtedly. He has now nothing more to stop in India for." "Why not as much as ever?" She looked at me curiously. "It is so hard to explain," she replied after a moment's pause, during which she had been drumming her little forefinger on the table. "I feel it rather than reason it. But don't you see that a certain change has lately come over Sebastian's attitude? He no longer desires to follow me. He wants to avoid me. That is why I wish more than ever to dog his steps. I feel the beginning of the end has come. I am gaining my point. Sebastian is wavering." "Then when he engages a berth, you propose to go by the same steamer?" "Yes. It makes all the difference. When he tries to follow me, he is dangerous. When he tries to avoid me, it becomes my work in life to follow him. I must keep him in sight every minute now. I must quicken his conscience. I must make him feel his own desperate wickedness. He is afraid to face me. That means remorse. The more I compel him to face me, the more the remorse is sure to deepen." I saw she was right. We took the train to Bombay. I found rooms at the Hospital Club, by a member's invitation, while Hilda went to stop with some friends of Lady Meadowcroft's on the Malabar Hill. We waited for Sebastian to come down from the interior and take his passage. Hilda, with her intuitive certainty, felt sure he would come. End of chapter 11, part 1. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 11, Part 2 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose, by Grant Allen. Chapter 11, Part 2. A steamer, two steamers, three steamers sailed, and still no Sebastian. I began to think he must have made up his mind to go back some other way, but Hilda was confident, so I waited patiently. At last one morning I dropped in, as I had often done before, at the office of one of the chief steamship companies. It was the very morning when a packet was to sail. "Can I see the list of passengers on the Vindhya?" I asked the clerk, a sandy-haired Englishman, tall, thin, and sallow. The clerk produced it. I scanned it in haste. To my surprise and delight, a penciled entry halfway down the list gave the name Professor Sebastian. "Oh, Sebastian is going by this steamer?" I murmured, looking up. A sandy-haired clerk hummed and hesitated. "Well, I believe he is going, sir," he answered at last, "but it's a bit uncertain. He's a fidgety man, the professor. He came down here this morning and asked to see the list, the same as you have done. Then he engaged a berth provisionally. Mind, provisionally, he said. That's why his name is only put in on the list in pencil. I take it he's waiting to know whether a party of friends he wishes to meet are going also." Or wishes to avoid, I thought to myself inwardly, but I did not say so. I asked instead, "Is he coming again?" "Yes, I think so, at 5:30." "And she sails at 7?" "At 7 punctually. Passengers must be aboard by 6:30 at latest." "Very good," I answered, making up my mind promptly. "I only called to know the Professor's movements. Don't mention to him that I came. I may look in again myself an hour or two later." "You don't want a passage, sir? You may be the friend he's expecting." "No, I don't want a passage, not at present, certainly." Then I ventured on a bold stroke. "Look here," I said, leaning across towards him, and assuming a confidential tone, "I am a private detective," which was perfectly true in essence, "and I am dogging the Professor, who, for all his eminence, is gravely suspected of a great crime. If you will help me, I will make it worth your while. Let us understand one another. I offer you a £5 note to say nothing of all this to him." The sallow clerk's fishy eyes glistened. "You can depend upon me," he answered, with an acquiescent nod. I judged that he didn't often get the chance of earning some 80 rupees so easily. I scribbled a hasty note and sent it round to Hilda. "Pack your boxes at once, and hold yourself in readiness to embark on the Vindhya at 6 o'clock precisely." Then I put my own things straight and waited at the club till 5:45. At that time I strolled on unconcernedly into the office. A cab outside held Hilda and our luggage. I had arranged it all meanwhile by letter. "Professor Sebastian been here again?" I asked. "Yes, sir, he's been here, and he looked over the list again, and he's taken his passage. But he muttered something about eavesdroppers, and said that if he wasn't satisfied when he got on board, he would return at once and ask for a cabin in exchange by the next steamer." "That will do," I answered, slipping the promised £5 note into the clerk's open palm, which closed over it convulsively. "Talked about eavesdroppers, did he? Then he knows he's been shadowed. It may console you to learn that you are instrumental in furthering the aims of justice and unmasking a cruel and wicked conspiracy. Now, the next thing is this. I want 2 berths at once by this very steamer, one for myself, name of Cumberledge, and one for a lady, name of Wade, and look sharp about it." The sandy-haired man did look sharp, and within 3 minutes we were driving off with our tickets to Prince's Dock landing stage. We slipped on board unobtrusively, and instantly took refuge in our respective staterooms till the steamer was well under way and fairly out of sight of Kolaba Island. Only after all chance of Sebastian's avoiding us was gone for ever did we venture up on deck on purpose to confront him. It was one of those delicious balmy evenings which one gets only at sea and in the warmer latitudes. The sky was alive with myriads of twinkling and palpitating stars, which seemed to come and go like sparks on a fire back, as one gazed upwards into the vast depths and tried to place them. They played hide and seek with one another and with the innumerable meteors, which shot recklessly every now and again across the field of the firmament, leaving momentary furrows of light behind them. Beneath, the sea sparkled almost like the sky, for every turn of the screw churned up the scintillating phosphorescence in the water, so that countless little jets of living fire seemed to flash and die away at the summit of every wavelet. A tall, spare man in a picturesque cloak, and with long, lank white hair, leant over the taffrail, gazing at the numberless flashing lights of the surface. As he gazed, he talked on in his clear, rapt voice to a stranger by his side. The voice and the ring of enthusiasm were unmistakable. "Oh no," he was saying as we stole up behind him, "that hypothesis, I venture to assert, is no longer tenable by the light of recent researches. Death and decay have nothing to do directly with the phosphorescence of the sea, though they have a little indirectly. The light is due in the main to numerous minute living organisms, most of them bacilli, on which I once made several close observations and crucial experiments. They possess organs which may be regarded as miniature bull's eye lanterns, and these organs—" "What a lovely evening, Hubert!" Hilda said to me in an apparently unconcerned voice, as the Professor reached this point in his exposition. Sebastian's voice quavered and stammered for a moment. He tried, just at first, to continue and complete his sentence. "And these organs," he went on aimlessly, "these bull's eyes that I spoke about are so arranged, I was speaking on the subject of crustaceans, I think, crustaceans so arranged—" Then he broke down utterly and turned sharply round to me. He did not look at Hilda, I think he did not dare, but he faced me with his head down and his long thin neck protruded, eyeing me from under those overhanging penthouse brows of his. "You sneak!" he cried passionately. "You sneak! You have dogged me by false pretenses. You have lied to bring this about. You have come aboard under a false name, you and your accomplice." I faced him in turn, erect and unflinching. "Professor Sebastian," I answered in my coldest and calmest tone, "you say what is not true. If you consult the list of passengers by the windeyah, now posted near the companion ladder, you will find the names of Hilda Wade and Hubert Cumberledge duly entered. We took our passage after you inspected the list at the office to see whether our names were there, in order to avoid us. But you cannot avoid us. We do not mean that you shall avoid us. We will dog you now through life, not by lies or subterfuge, as you say, but openly and honestly. It is you who need to slink and cower, not we. The prosecutor need not descend to the sordid shifts of the criminal." The other passenger had sidled away quietly the moment he saw our conversation was likely to be private, and I spoke in a low voice, though clearly and impressively, because I did not wish for a scene. I was only endeavoring to keep alive the slow, smoldering fire of remorse in the man's bosom, and I saw I had touched him on a spot that hurt. Sebastian drew himself up and answered nothing. For a minute or two he stood erect, with folded arms, gazing moodily before him. Then he said, as if to himself, "I owe the man my life. He nursed me through the plague. If it had not been for that, if he had not tended me so carefully in that valley in Nepaul, I would throw him overboard now, catch him in my arms and throw him overboard. I would, and be hanged for it." He walked past us as if he saw us not. Silent, erect, moody. Hilda stepped aside and let him pass. He never even looked at her. I knew why. He dared not. Every day now, remorse for the evil part he had played in her life, respect for the woman who had unmasked and outwitted him, made it more and more impossible for Sebastian to face her. During the whole of that voyage, though he dined in the same saloon and paced the same deck, he never spoke to her, he never so much as looked at her. Once or twice their eyes met by accident, and Hilda stared him down. Sebastian's eyelids dropped, and he stole away uneasily. In public we gave no overt sign of our differences, but it was understood on board that the relations were strained, that Professor Sebastian and Dr. Cumberledge had been working at the same hospital in London together, and that owing to some disagreement between them, Dr. Cumberledge had resigned, which made it most awkward for them to be traveling together by the same steamer. We passed through the Suez Canal and down the Mediterranean. All the time Sebastian never again spoke to us. The passengers indeed held aloof from the solitary, gloomy old man, who strode along the quarter deck with his long, slow stride, absorbed in his own thoughts, and intent only on avoiding Hilda and myself. His mood was unsociable. As for Hilda, her helpful, winning ways made her a favorite with all the women, as her pretty face did with all the men. For the first time in his life, Sebastian seemed to be aware that he was shunned. He retired more and more within himself for company. His keen eyes began to lose in some degree its extraordinary fire, his expression to forget its magnetic attractiveness. Indeed, it was only young men of scientific tastes that Sebastian could ever attract. Among them his eager zeal, his single-minded devotion to the cause of science, awoke always a responsive chord which vibrated powerfully. Day after day passed, and we steamed through the straits and neared the Channel. Our thoughts began to assume a home complexion. Everybody was full of schemes as to what he would do when he reached England. Old Bradshaws were overhauled and trains looked out, on the supposition that we would get in by such an hour on Tuesday. We were steaming along the French coast off the western promontory of Brittany. The evening was fine, and though of course less warm than we had experienced of late, yet pleasant and summer-like. We watched the distant cliffs of the Finistère mainland, and the numerous little islands that lie off the shore, all basking in the unreal glow of a deep red sunset. The first officer was in charge, a very cocksure and careless young man, handsome and dark-haired, the sort of young man who thought more of creating an impression upon the minds of the lady passengers than of the duties of his position. "Aren't you going down to your berth?" I asked of Hilda about 10:30 that night. "The air is so much colder here than you have been feeling it of late, that I'm afraid of your chilling yourself." She looked up at me with a smile, and drew her little fluffy white woolen wrap closer about her shoulders. "Am I so very valuable to you, then?" she asked, for I suppose my glance had been a trifle too tender for a mere acquaintance's. "No, thank you, Hubert. I don't think I'll go down. And if you're wise, you won't go down either. I distrust this first officer. He's a careless navigator, and tonight his head's too full of that pretty Mrs. Ogilvy. He has been flirting with her desperately ever since we left Bombay, and tomorrow he knows he will lose her forever. His mind isn't occupied with the navigation at all. What he's thinking of is how soon his watch will be over, so that he may come down off the bridge onto the quarterdeck to talk to her. Don't you see she's lurking over yonder, looking up at the stars, and waiting for him by the compass? Poor child, she has a bad husband, and now she has let herself get too much entangled with this empty young fellow. I shall be glad for her sake to see her safely landed and out of the man's clutches." As she spoke, the first officer glanced down towards Mrs. Ogilvy, and held out his chronometer with an encouraging smile which seemed to say, "Only an hour and a half more. Now, at 12 I shall be with you." "Perhaps you're right, Hilda," I answered, taking a seat beside her, and throwing away my cigar. "This is one of the worst bits of the French coast that we're approaching. We're not far off Ushant. I wish the captain were on the bridge instead of this helter-skelter, self-conceited young fellow. He's too cocksure. He knows so much about seamanship that he could take a ship through any rocks on his course, blindfold, in his own opinion. I always doubt a man who is so much at home in his subject that he never has to think about it. Most things in this world are done by thinking." "We can't see the Ushant light," Hilda remarked, looking ahead. "No, there's a little haze about on the horizon, I fancy. See, the stars are fading away. It begins to feel damp. Sea mist in the channel." Hilda sat uneasily in her deck chair. "That's bad," she answered. for the first officer is taking no more heed of Ushant than of his latter end. He has forgotten the existence of the Breton coast. His head is just stuffed with Mrs. Ogilvy's eyelashes. Very pretty long eyelashes, too, I don't deny it, but they won't help him to get through the narrow channel. They say it's dangerous. Dangerous, I answered. Not a bit of it with reasonable care. Nothing at sea is dangerous except the inexplicable recklessness of navigators. There's always plenty of sea room, if they care to take it. Collisions and icebergs, to be sure, are dangers that can't be avoided at times, especially if there's fog about. But I've been enough at sea in my time to know this much at least, that no coast in the world is dangerous except by dint of reckless corner cutting. Captains of great ships behave exactly like two hansom drivers in the streets of London. They think they can just shave past without grazing, and they do shave past 9 times out of 10. The 10th time they run on the rocks through sheer recklessness, and lose their vessel. And then the newspapers always ask the same solemn question, in childish good faith: how did so experienced and able a navigator come to make such a mistake in his reckoning? He made no mistake. He simply tried to cut it fine, and cut it too fine for once, with the result that he usually loses his own life and his passengers. That's all. We who have been at sea understand that perfectly. Just at that moment another passenger strolled up and joined us, a Bengal civil servant. He drew his chair over by Hilda's and began discussing Mrs. Ogilvy's eyes and the first officer's flirtations. Hilda hated gossip, and took refuge in generalities. In 3 minutes the talk had wandered off to Ibsen's influence on the English drama, and we had forgotten the very existence of the Isle of Ushant. "The English public will never understand Ibsen," the newcomer said reflectively, with the omniscient air of the Indian civilian. "He is too purely Scandinavian. He represents that part of the continental mind which is farthest removed from the English temperament. To him respectability, our God, is not only no fetish, it is the unspeakable thing, the Moabitish abomination. He will not bow down to the golden image which our British Nebuchadnezzar, King Demos, has made, and which he asks us to worship. And the British Nebuchadnezzar will never get beyond the worship of his Vishnu, respectability, the deity of the pure and blameless ratepayer. So Ibsen must always remain a sealed book to the vast majority of the English people." "That is true," Hilda answered, "as to his direct influence. But don't you think indirectly he is leavening England? A man so wholly out of tune with the prevailing note of English life could only effect it, of course, by means of disciples and popularizers, often even popularizers who but dimly and distantly apprehend his meaning. He must be interpreted to the English by English intermediaries, half Philistine themselves, who speak his language ill, and who miss the greater part of his message. Yet only by such half hints. Why, what was that? I think I saw something." Even as she uttered the words, a terrible jar ran fiercely through the ship from stem to stern, a jar that made one clench one's teeth and hold one's jaws tight, the jar of a prow that chattered against a rock. I took it all in at a glance. We had forgotten Ushant, but Ushant had not forgotten us. It had revenged itself upon us by revealing its existence. In a moment all was turmoil and confusion on deck. I cannot describe the scene that followed. Sailors rushed to and fro, unfastening ropes and lowering boats with admirable discipline. Women shrieked and cried aloud in helpless terror. The voice of the first officer could be heard above the din, endeavoring to atone by courage and coolness in the actual disaster for its recklessness in causing it. Passengers rushed on deck half clad, and waited for their turn to take places in the boats. It was a time of terror, turmoil, and hubbub. But in the midst of it all, Hilda turned to me with infinite calm in her voice. "Where is Sebastian?" she asked in a perfectly collected tone. "Whatever happens, we must not lose sight of him." "I'm here," another voice, equally calm, responded beside her. "You are a brave woman. Whether I sink or swim, I admire your courage, your steadfastness of purpose." It was the only time he had addressed a word to her during the entire voyage. They put the women and children into the first boats lowered. Mothers and little ones went first, single women and widows after. "Now, Miss Wade," the first officer said, taking her gently by the shoulders when her turn arrived. "Make haste, don't keep us waiting." But Hilda held back. "No, no," she said firmly. "I won't go yet. I'm waiting for the men's boat. I must not leave Professor Sebastian." The first officer shrugged his shoulders. There was no time for protest. "Next, then," he said quickly. "Miss Martin, Miss Weatherly." Sebastian took her hand and tried to force her in. "You must go," he said in a low, persuasive tone. "You must not wait for me." He hated to see her, I knew, but I imagined in his voice, for I noted it even then, there rang some undertone of genuine desire to save her. Hilda loosened his grasp resolutely. "No, no," she answered. "I cannot fly. I shall never leave you." "Not even if I promise?" She shook her head and closed her lips hard. "Certainly not," she said again after a pause. "I cannot trust you. Besides, I must stop by your side and do my best to save you. Your life is all in all to me. I dare not risk it." His gaze was now pure admiration. "As you will," he answered, "for he that loseth his life shall gain it." "If ever we land alive," Hilda answered, glowing red in spite of the danger, "I shall remind you of that word. I shall call upon you to fulfill it." The boat was lowered, and still Hilda stood by my side. 1 second later another shock shook us. The windaya parted amidships, and we found ourselves struggling and choking in the cold sea water. It was a miracle that every soul of us was not drowned that moment, as many of us were. The swirling eddy which followed as the windaya sank swamped two of the boats and carried down not a few of those who were standing on the deck with us. The last I saw of the first officer was a writhing form whirled about in the water. Before he sank, he shouted aloud with a seaman's frank courage: "Say it was all my fault. I accept the responsibility. I ran her too close. I'm the only one to blame for it." Then he disappeared in the whirlpool caused by the sinking ship, and we were left still struggling. One of the life rafts, hastily rigged by the sailors, floated our way. Hilda struck out a stroke or two and caught it. She dragged herself on to it and beckoned me to follow. I could see she was holding on to something tightly. I struck out in turn and reached the raft, which was composed of two seats, fastened together in haste at the first note of danger. I hauled myself up by Hilda's side. "Help me to pull him aboard," she cried in an agonized voice. "I'm afraid he has lost consciousness." Then I looked at the object she was clutching in her hands. It was Sebastian's white head, apparently quite lifeless. I pulled him up with her and laid him out on the raft. A very faint breeze from the southwest had sprung up. That and a strong seaward current that sets round the rocks were carrying us straight out from the Breton coast and all chance of rescue towards the open channel. But Hilda thought nothing of such physical danger. "We have saved him, Hubert," she cried, clasping her hands. "We have saved him. But do you think he is alive? For unless he is, my chance, our chance, is gone forever." I bent over and felt his pulse. As far as I could make out, it still beat feebly. End of chapter 11, part 2. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 12 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose by Grant Allen. Chapter 12. The episode of the dead man who spoke. I will not trouble you with details of those 3 terrible days and nights when we drifted helplessly about at the mercy of the currents on our improvised life raft up and down the English Channel. The first night was the worst. Slowly after that we grew used to the danger, the cold, the hunger, and the thirst. Our senses were numbed. We passed whole hours together in a sort of torpor, just vaguely wondering whether a ship would come in sight to save us, obeying the merciful law that those who are utterly exhausted are incapable of acute fear, and acquiescing in the probability of our own extinction. But however slender the chance, and as the hours stole on it seemed slender enough, Hilda still kept her hopes fixed mainly on Sebastian. No daughter could have watched the father she loved more eagerly and closely than Hilda watched her lifelong enemy, the man who had wrought such evil upon her and hers. To save our own lives without him would be useless. At all hazards she must keep him alive on the bare chance of a rescue. If he died, there died with him the last hope of justice and redress. As for Sebastian, after the first half hour during which he lay white and unconscious, he opened his eyes faintly, as we could see by the moonlight, and gazed around him with a strange puzzled state of inquiry. Then his senses returned to him by degrees. "What, you, Cumberledge?" he murmured, measuring me with his eye. "And you, Nurse Wade? Well, I thought you would manage it." There was a tone almost of amusement in his voice, a half ironical tone which had been familiar to us in the old hospital days. He raised himself on one arm and gazed at the water all round. Then he was silent for some minutes. At last he spoke again. "Do you know what I ought to do if I were consistent?" he asked with a tinge of pathos in his words. "Jump off this raft and deprive you of your last chance of triumph, the triumph which you have worked for so hard. You want to save my life for your own ends, not for mine. Why should I help you to my own undoing?" Hilda's voice was tenderer and softer than usual as she answered, "No, not for my own ends alone, and not for your undoing, but to give you one last chance of unburdening your conscience. Some men are too small to be capable of remorse. Their little souls have no room for such a feeling. You are great enough to feel it and to try to crush it down. But you cannot crush it down. It crops up in spite of you. You have tried to bury it in your soul, and you have failed. It is your remorse that has driven you to make so many attempts against the only living souls who knew and understood. If ever we get safely to land once more, and God knows it is not likely, I give you still the chance of repairing the mischief you have done, and of clearing my father's memory from the cruel stain which you, and only you, can wipe away." Sebastian lay long silent once more, gazing up at her fixedly, with the foggy, white moonlight shining upon his bright, inscrutable eyes. "You are a brave woman, Maisie York Bannerman," he said at last slowly. "A very brave woman. I will try to live. I, too, for a purpose of my own. I say it again. He that loseth his life shall gain it." Incredible as it may sound, in half an hour more he was lying fast asleep on that wave-tossed raft, and Hilda and I were watching him tenderly. And it seemed to us as we watched him that a change had come over those stern and impassive features. They had softened and melted until his face was that of a gentler and better type. It was as if some inward change of soul was moulding the fierce old professor into a nobler and more venerable man. Day after day we drifted on, without food or water. The agony was terrible. I will not attempt to describe it, for to do so is to bring it back too clearly to my memory. Hilda and I, being younger and stronger, bore up against it well. But Sebastian, old and worn, and still weak from the plague, grew daily weaker. His pulse just beat, and sometimes I could hardly feel it thrill under my finger. He became delirious and murmured much about York Bannerman's daughter. Sometimes he forgot all and spoke to me in the friendly terms of our old acquaintance at Nathaniel's, giving me directions and advice about imaginary operations. Hour after hour we watched for a sail, and no sail appeared. One could hardly believe we could toss about so long in the main highway of traffic without seeing a ship or spying more than the smoke trail of some passing steamer. As far as I could judge, during those days and nights, the wind veered from southwest to southeast, and carried us steadily and surely towards the open Atlantic. On the third evening out, about 5 o'clock, I saw a dark object on the horizon. Was it moving towards us? We strained our eyes in breathless suspense. A minute passed, and then another. Yes, there could be no doubt. It grew larger and larger. It was a ship, a steamer. We made all the signs of distress we could manage. I stood up and waved Hilda's white shawl frantically in the air. There was half an hour of suspense, and our hearts sank as we thought that they were about to pass us. Then the steamer hove to a little and seemed to notice us. Next instant we dropped upon our knees, for we saw they were lowering a boat. They were coming to our aid. They would be in time to save us. Hilda watched our rescuers with parted lips and agonized eyes. Then she felt Sebastian's pulse. "Thank Heaven!" she cried. "He still lives. They will be here before he is quite past confession." Sebastian opened his eyes dreamily. "A boat?" he asked. "Yes, a boat." "Then you have gained your point, child. I am able to collect myself. Give me a few hours more life, and what I can do to make amends to you shall be done." I don't know why, but it seemed longer between the time when the boat was lowered and the moment when it reached us than it had seemed during the 3 days and nights we lay tossing about helplessly on the open Atlantic. There were times when we could hardly believe it was really moving. At last, however, it reached us, and we saw the kindly faces and outstretched hands of our rescuers. Hilda clung to Sebastian with a wild clasp as the men reached out for her. "No, take him first," she cried, when the sailors, after the custom of men, tried to help her into the gig before attempting to save us. "His life is worth more to me than my own. Take him, and for God's sake lift him gently, for he is nearly gone." They took him aboard and laid him down in the stern. Then, and then only, Hilda stepped into the boat, and I staggered after her. The officer in charge, a kind young Irishman, had had the foresight to bring brandy and a little beef essence. We ate and drank what we dared as they rowed us back to the steamer. Sebastian lay back, with his white eyelashes closed over the lids, and the livid hue of death upon his emaciated cheeks, but he drank a teaspoonful or two of brandy, and swallowed the beef essence with which Hilda fed him. "Your father is the most exhausted of the party," the officer said in a low undertone. "Poor fellow, he is too old for such adventures. He seems to have hardly a spark of life left in him." Hilda shuddered with evident horror. "He is not my father, thank Heaven!" she cried, leaning over him and supporting his drooping head, in spite of her own fatigue and the cold that chilled our very bones. "But I think he will live. I mean him to live. He is my best friend now, and my bitterest enemy." The officer looked at her in surprise, and then touched his forehead inquiringly, with a quick glance at me. He evidently thought cold and hunger had affected her reason. I shook my head. "It is a peculiar case," I whispered. "What the lady says is right. Everything depends for us upon our keeping him alive till we reach England." They rowed us to the boat, and we were handed tenderly up the side. There the ship's surgeon and everybody else on board did their best to restore us after our terrible experience. The ship was the Don, of the Royal Mail Steamship Company's West Indian Line, and nothing could exceed the kindness with which we were treated by every soul on board, from the captain to the stewardess and the junior cabin boy. Sebastian's great name carried weight even here. As soon as it was generally understood on board that we had brought with us the famous physiologist and pathologist, the man whose name was famous throughout Europe, we might have asked for anything that the ship contained without fear of a refusal. But indeed Hilda's sweet face was enough in itself to win the interest and sympathy of all who saw it. By 11 next morning we were off Plymouth Sound, and by midday we had landed at the Mill Bay docks, and were on our way to a comfortable hotel in the neighborhood. Hilda was too good a nurse to bother Sebastian at once about his implied promise. She had him put to bed and kept him there carefully. "What do you think of his condition?" she asked me after the second day was over. I could see by her own grave face that she had already formed her own conclusions. "He cannot recover," I answered. "His constitution, shattered by the plague and by his incessant exertions, has received too severe a shock in this shipwreck. He is doomed." "So I think. The change is but temporary. He will not last out 3 days more, I fancy." "He has rallied wonderfully to day," I said, "but 'tis a passing rally, a flicker, no more. If you wish to do anything, now is the moment. If you delay, you will be too late." "I will go in and see him," Hilda answered. "I have said nothing more to him, but I think he is moved. I think he means to keep his promise. He has shown a strange tenderness to me these last few days. I almost believe he is at last remorseful and ready to undo the evil which he has done." She stole softly into the sick room. I followed her on tiptoe, and stood near the door behind the screen which shut off the draught from the patient. Sebastian stretched his arms out to her. "Ah, Maisie, my child!" he cried, addressing her by the name she had borne in her childhood. Both were her own. "Don't leave me any more. Stay with me always, Maisie. I can't get on without you." "But you hated once to see me." "Because I have so wronged you." "And now, will you do nothing to repair the wrong?" "My child, I can never undo that wrong. It is irreparable, for the past can never be recalled. But I will try my best to minimize it. Call Cumberledge in. I am quite sensible now, quite conscious. You will be my witness, Cumberledge, that my pulse is normal and that my brain is clear. I will confess it all, Maisie. Your constancy and your firmness have conquered me, and your devotion to your father. If only I had had a daughter like you, my girl, one whom I could have loved and trusted, I might have been a better man. I might even have done better work for science, though, on that side at least, I have little with which to reproach myself." Hilda bent over him. "Hubert and I are here," she said slowly, in a strangely calm voice. "But that is not enough. I want a public, an attested confession.
It must be given before witnesses, and signed and sworn to. Somebody might throw doubt upon my word and Hubert's." Sebastian shrank back. "Given before witnesses, and signed and sworn to. Maisie, is this humiliation necessary? Do you exact it?" Hilda was inexorable. "You know yourself how you are situated. You have only a day or two to live," she said in an impressive voice. "You must do it at once or never. You have postponed it all your life. Now, at this last moment, you must make up for it. Will you die with an act of injustice unconfessed on your conscience?"
He paused and struggled. "I could, if it were not for you," he answered.
"Then do it for me!" Hilda cried. "Do it for me! I ask it of you not as a favor, but as a right. I demand it." She stood white, stern, inexorable, by his couch, and laid her hand upon his shoulder. He paused once more. Then he murmured feebly, in a querulous tone, "What witnesses? Whom do you wish to be present?" Hilda spoke clearly and distinctly. She had thought it all out with herself beforehand. "Such witnesses as will carry absolute conviction to the mind of all the world, irreproachable, disinterested witnesses, official witnesses. In the first place, a commissioner of oaths, then a Plymouth doctor, to show that you are in a fit state of mind to make a confession. Next, Mr. Horace Mayfield, who defended my father. Lastly, Dr. Blake Crawford, who watched the case on your behalf at the trial." "But, Hilda," I interposed, "we may possibly find that they cannot come away from London just now. They are busy men and likely to be engaged." "They will come if I pay their fees. I do not mind how much this costs me. What is money compared to this one great object of my life? And then, the delay. Suppose that we are too late. He will live some days yet. I can telegraph up at once. I want no hole and corner confession, which may afterwards be useless, but an open avowal before the most approved witnesses. If he will make it, well and good. If not, my life work will have failed. But I had rather it failed than draw back 1 inch from the course which I have laid down for myself." I looked at the worn face of Sebastian. He nodded his head slowly.
"She has conquered," he answered, turning upon the pillow. "Let her have her own way. I hid it for years for science's sake. That was my motive, Cumberledge, and I am too near death to lie. Science has now nothing more to gain or lose by me. I have served her well, but I am worn out in her service. Maisie may do as she will. I accept her ultimatum."
We telegraphed up at once. Fortunately, both men were disengaged, and both keenly interested in the case. By that evening Horace Mayfield was talking it all over with me in the hotel at Southampton.
"Well, Hubert, my boy," he said, "a woman we know can do a great deal."
He smiled his familiar smile, like a genial fat toad.
"But if your Jock Bannerman succeeds in getting a confession out of Sebastian, she'll extort my admiration."
He paused a moment, then he added in an afterthought,
"I say that she'll extort my admiration, but mind you, I don't know that I shall feel inclined to believe it. The facts have always appeared to me, strictly between ourselves, you know, to admit of only one explanation."
"Wait and see," I answered. "You think it more likely that Miss Wade will have persuaded Sebastian to confess to things that never happened, than that he will convince you of Jock Bannerman's innocence?" The great Q.C. fingered his cigarette holder affectionately.
"You hit it the first time," he answered. "That is precisely my attitude. The evidence against our poor friend was so peculiarly black, it would take a great deal to make me disbelieve it."
"But surely a confession—"
"Ah, well, let me hear the confession, and then I shall be better able to judge."
Even as he spoke, Hilda had entered the room. "There will be no difficulty about that, Mr. Mayfield. You shall hear it, and I trust that it will make you repent for taking so black a view of the case of your own client." "Without prejudice, Miss Bannerman, without prejudice," said the lawyer with some confusion. "Our conversation is entirely between ourselves, and to the world I have always upheld that your father was an innocent man." But such distinctions are too subtle for a loving woman. "He was an innocent man," she said angrily. "It was your business not only to believe it, but to prove it. You have neither believed it nor proved it, but if you will come upstairs with me, I will show you that I have done both." Mayfield glanced at me and shrugged his fat shoulders. Hilda had led the way, and we both followed her. In the room of the sick man our other witnesses were waiting. A tall, dark, austere man, who was introduced to me as Dr. Blake Crawford, whose name I had heard as having watched the case for Sebastian at the time of the investigation. There were present also a commissioner of oaths, and Dr. Maybe, a small local practitioner, whose attitude towards the great scientist was almost absurdly reverential. The three men were grouped at the foot of the bed, and Mayfield and I joined them. Hilda stood beside the dying man and rearranged the pillow against which he was propped. Then she held some brandy to his lips. "Now," said she. The stimulant brought a shade of color into his ghastly cheeks, and the old quick, intelligent gleam came back into his deep sunk eyes. "A remarkable woman, gentlemen," said he. "A very noteworthy woman. I had prided myself that my will power was the most powerful in the country. I had never met any to match it, but I do not mind admitting that, for firmness and tenacity, this lady is my equal. She was anxious that I should adopt one course of action. I was determined to adopt another. Your presence here is a proof that she has prevailed." He paused for breath, and she gave him another small sip of the brandy. "I execute her will ungrudgingly, and with the conviction that it is the right and proper course for me to take," he continued. "You will forgive me some of the ill which I have done you, Maisie, when I tell you that I really died this morning, all unknown to Cumberledge and you, and that nothing but my will force has sufficed to keep spirit and body together until I should carry out your will in the manner which you suggested. I shall be glad when I have finished, for the effort is a painful one, and I long for the peace of dissolution. It is now 7:15. I have every hope that I may be able to leave before 8." It was strange to hear the perfect coolness with which he discussed his own approaching dissolution. Calm, pale, and impassive, his manner was that of a professor addressing his class. I had seen him speak so to a ring of dressers in the old days at Nathaniel's. "The circumstances which led up to the death of Admiral Scott Prideaux, and the suspicions which caused the arrest of Dr. York Bannerman, have never yet been fully explained, although they were by no means so profound that they might not have been unravelled at the time had a man of intellect concentrated his attention upon them. The police, however, were incompetent, and the legal advisers of Dr. Bannerman hardly less so. And a woman only has had the wit to see that a gross injustice has been done. The true facts I will now lay before you." Mayfield's broad face had reddened with indignation, but now his curiosity drove out every other emotion, and he leaned forward with the rest of us to hear the old man's story. "In the first place, I must tell you that both Dr. Bannerman and myself were engaged at the time in an investigation upon the nature and properties of the vegetable alkaloids, and especially of aconitine.
We hoped for the very greatest results from this drug, and we were both equally enthusiastic in our research. Especially, we had reasons to believe that it might have a most successful action in the case of a certain rare but deadly disease into the nature of which I need not enter. Reasoning by analogy, we were convinced that we had a certain cure for this particular ailment. Our investigation, however, was somewhat hampered by the fact that the condition in question is rare out of tropical countries, and that in our hospital wards we had not, at that time, any example of it. So serious was this obstacle that it seemed that we must leave other men more favorably situated to reap the benefit of our work and enjoy the credit of our discovery. But a curious chance gave us exactly what we were in search of. At the instant when we were about to despair, it was York Bannerman who came to me in my laboratory one day to tell me that he had in his private practice the very condition of which we were in search. The patient, said he, is my uncle, Admiral Scott Prideaux. Your uncle! I cried in amazement. But how came he to develop such a condition? His last commission in the Navy was spent upon the Malabar coast, where the disease is endemic. There can be no doubt that it has been latent in his system ever since, and that the irritability of temper and indecision of character of which his family have so often had to complain were really among the symptoms of his complaint. I examined the Admiral in consultation with my colleague, and I confirmed his diagnosis. But to my surprise, York Bannerman showed the most invincible and reprehensible objection to experiment upon his relative. In vain I assured him that he must place his duty to science high above all other considerations. It was only after great pressure that I could persuade him to add an infinitesimal portion of aconitine to his prescriptions. The drug was a deadly one, he said, and the toxic dose was still to be determined. He could not push it in the case of a relative who trusted himself to his care. I tried to shake him in what I regarded as his absurd squeamishness, but in vain. But I had another resource. Bannerman's prescriptions were made up by a fellow named Barclay, who had been dispenser at Nathaniel's, and afterwards set up as a chemist in Sackville Street. This man was absolutely in my power. I had discovered him at Nathaniel's in dishonest practices, and I held evidence which would have sent him to jail. I held this over him now, and I made him, unknown to Bannerman, increase the doses of aconitine in the medicine until they were sufficient for my experimental purposes. I will not enter into figures, but suffice it that Bannerman was giving more than 10 times what he imagined. You know the sequel. I was called in and suddenly found that I had Bannerman in my power. There had been a very keen rivalry between us in science. He was the only man in England whose career might impinge upon mine. I had this supreme chance of putting him out of my way. He could not deny that he had been giving his uncle aconitine. I could prove that his uncle had died of aconitine. He could not himself account for the facts. He was absolutely in my power. I did not wish him to be condemned, Maisie. I only hoped that he would leave the court discredited and ruined. I give you my word that my evidence would have saved him from the scaffold."
Hilda was listening with a set white face. "Proceed," said she, and held out the brandy once more.
"I did not give the Admiral any more aconitine after I had taken over the case, but what was already in his system was enough. It was evident that we had seriously underestimated the lethal dose. As to your father, Maisie, You have done me an injustice. You have always thought that I killed him."
"Proceed," said she.
"I speak now from the brink of the grave, and I tell you that I did not. His heart was always weak, and it broke down under the strain. Indirectly I was the cause. I do not seek to excuse anything, but it was the sorrow and the shame that killed him. As to Berkeley the chemist, that is another matter. I will not deny that I was concerned in that mysterious disappearance, which was a 7 days' wonder in the press. I could not permit my scientific calm to be interrupted by the blackmailing visits of so insignificant a person. And then, after many years, you came, Maisie. You also got between me and that work which was life to me. You also showed that you would rake up this old matter and bring dishonor upon a name which has stood for something in science. You also, but you will forgive me, I have held on to life for your sake as an atonement for my sins. Now I go. Cumberledge, your notebook. Subjective sensations, swimming in the head, light flashes before the eyes, soothing torpor, some touch of coldness, constriction of the temples, humming in the ears, a sense of sinking, sinking, sinking.
It was an hour later, and Hilda and I were alone in the chamber of death. As Sebastian lay there, a marble figure, with his keen eyes closed, and his pinched, thin face whiter and serener than ever, I could not help gazing at him with some pangs of recollection. I could not avoid recalling the time when his very name was to me a word of power, and when the thought of him roused on my cheek a red flush of enthusiasm. As I looked, I murmured two lines from Browning's Grammarian's Funeral: "This is our master, famous, calm, and dead, borne on our shoulders." Hilda Wade, standing beside me with an awe-struck air, added a stanza from the same great poem: "Lofty designs must close in like effects, loftily lying. Leave him still loftier than the world suspects, living and dying." I gazed at her with admiration. "And it is you, Hilda, who pay him this generous tribute?" I cried. "You of all women!" "Yes, it is I," she answered. "He was a great man after all, Hubert, not good, but great. And greatness by itself extorts our unwilling homage." "Hilda," I cried, "you are a great woman, and a good woman too. It makes me proud to think you will soon be my wife, for there is now no longer any just cause or impediment." Beside the dead master she laid her hand solemnly and calmly in mine. "No impediment," she answered. "I have vindicated and cleared my father's memory, and now I can live. Actual life comes next. We have much to do, Hubert." End of chapter 12, and end of the book of Hilda Wade by Grant Allen. Read by Lars Rolander. Thank you for listening. And for more exciting books, go to LibriVox.org.